Hey guys, how is it going? Welcome to the AP Euro live stream for looking at the causes of World War One. So I know that this is probably a really crazy time for everybody. It's a crazy time for me too. I know that most of us are probably learning from home. And are stuck at home and have been stuck at home for quite a while. We're working through it kind of one step at a time, but I appreciate you guys all being here, and hopefully I can help really in any way with you guys, with locking down this content and hopefully taking the AP exam at the scheduled time. But we'll see what happens. But I hope everybody's doing well. I hope everybody is surviving quarantine and is surviving staying at home with family and being locked in a room together or being locked in a house together. And I hope it's going okay. If you would drop an emoji in chat, let me know to describe how your quarantine is going currently, how that learning at home is going currently. For me, I think it's a mix between a frowny face and a thumbs up. If you could do that, yeah, Aubrey, I agree. The question, the kind of like thinking emoji is really apt and appropriate for this, because we're working through this a little bit at a time and trying to figure it out. And the great thing is that like, teachers are just as clueless as students are, in all honesty. I have no idea what I'm doing. All the teachers that I talk to regularly have no idea what they're doing, and we're just kind of working through it one day at a time. So this really is unprecedented, and but I appreciate you guys tuning in for that. But let's put all that out of our heads while we go back about 100 years to talk about the start of World War One. This is, personally, in Texas, our at-home learning starts next week. Oh, awesome! So you guys get a week to kind of decompress. Okay, awesome. We started today. Actually, was our first day at home learning, and so we had a few days to kind of decompress. But the start of World War One is probably personally one of my favorite things to talk about. World War One in general, I think, is super interesting and is really. It doesn't get the justice it deserves oftentimes, because it is probably the biggest kind of tipping points in history, one of the biggest tipping points in history, even more than like World War II, you could argue. I think it's super important and really interesting and really fascinating to study. Thankfully we're starting to get some movies that highlight that. If you get a chance, the movie 1917 is excellent portrayal of World War One, and I think might be the best World War One movie ever made. But I'm getting a little bit off topic. But today we're going to focus on the start of that war, and we're going to kind of set the scene and look at what Europe looks like going into 1914. And going into this really completely ground-changing, complete overhaul of European society, that is World War One. And so what does Europe look like? Why does it start? And when we're thinking about the start of World War One, it's really easy when we think about that to think about the things like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Because that is kind of like, that's like the little one-liner of like, why does World War One start? Oh, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And while that does play a really important part, it's almost like that's the bullet that's fired from the gun. But we got to figure out, who made the gun and why that gun was made, right? Like that's kind of the way to think about it, is like, when we're thinking about, we don't think about the individual bullet, we think about the gun itself. And the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is just the bullet that was shot out of the gun. We're going to try to really understand how this whole process is created from the ground up. So that's the plan for today. So before we jump in to talking about to going through the content, if you have questions as we go through, And this is really if you have questions about this, or if you have questions about like 1800 stuff, anything from that century, drop them in the Ask a Question tab. I'll be keeping up with that regularly, and it's that's really good for me because it keeps them all in one place. If you have a comment that you want to make, that's where put it in the comment section. But if you have a question, throw it in that Ask a Question tab, and we'll get through it as we go through. Okay. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this. So let me share my screen with you guys. There we go. Let's present and presenter view. And we're off to the gosh darn races here. Uh-oh, it's not what I wanted to do. You might just see a big version of my face, honestly, which that's okay. You know what? I think we're going to roll with this. Yeah, that'll work. That'll work. Oh, there we go. Perfect. It fixed itself. I love when technology fixes itself. All right. So the causes of World War I with me, Mr. Kuklik. I am an AP Euro teacher, teaching out of South Carolina. And I've been teaching this class for 4 years. Yeah, that's about all the intro I need to give you guys about me. But before we begin, I do want to talk a little bit about what the streaming schedule looks like for next week. So Mondays, we do math and English through Fiveable. So you can see those times there. Tuesdays are social sciences, so your human geography, psychology, U.S. government. Wednesdays is sciences, and then Thursday is history, world history, U.S. and Euro. Now, I will say that we are offering some daytime streams now because we can allow for it, right? Teachers are home, students are home during the day. Let's rock and roll. So we are offering some daytime streams. So I would say check Fiveable's Twitter and the Fiveable website, and you'll see when those are posted. A lot of them are review sessions as well. So definitely tune into those. Okay. Now, this is the calendar for through April, what the live streams are going to be looking like here. Okay. So next week will be World War I. We are not really going to dig into the actual events of the war. We're really going to be talking about the causes of the war. So if you want a full overview of what happens during World War I, which I highly, highly, highly recommend, next Thursday is your chance to buff up on that. April 2nd is the Great Depression. April 9th, which the Great Depression was a short answer question on the AP exam last year. So just throwing that out there. April 9th is the rise of fascism. April 16th is World War II. April 23rd is the Cold War, and April 30th is globalization and the modern era. So that's what the calendar looks like going forward with that. So like I mentioned, the best place to find all this stuff is if you just follow @ThinkFiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. You can also check out their website. All that info is there as well. Okay. But let's go ahead and dig on into it. So what are we going to be talking about in this stream? First and foremost, I will give an overview of the war. So I'll talk a little bit about why do we care about World War I? Why is it important? Why should we really understand the causes and effects of this war? Then I'll talk about the four main causes of the war. These are typically, when we think about the war, what's associated with it. And there's a fun acronym that's associated with the causes of World War I. The immediate causes of the war. Okay, so these are like the short-term causes. So this would be stuff like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And then we'll talk about the start of the war. and then we'll wrap things up. Okay, so we really are just going to be talking about the causes of the war, not necessarily the events of it and the effects of it. Okay. All right. Any questions so far? If you got any questions for me, throw them in the Ask a Question tab. If not, I'm going to go ahead and jump on in. All right, let's do it. All right, so World War I, what was it? World War I was a war lasting from 1914 to 1918 that, as the name suggests, touched every single part of the world in some way or another. So while this war, you don't see fighting in, every single place, it is going to have worldwide consequences and impacts, okay? Whether you were fighting in the war, whether your economy was damaged or helped because of the war, or if your government was collapsed because of the war. It's going to have lasting, long, big impacts here, okay? So for an example, in Australia, the Australians and New Zealanders, I think that's the right word, they fight for the British in World War I. Was there fighting in New Zealand? No, but they went to go fight because they were a part of the larger British Empire. Another really good World War I movie is Gallipoli. You get to hear Mel Gibson's Australian accent, and you get to hear him run, or you get to see him run a lot. Gallipoli is a really good World War I movie too, but that focuses on a band of Australian soldiers in World War I. So it does have very, very big worldly consequences and worldly impacts. Okay, so that's why we really consider it the First World War. And of course, during and after it happens, it's referred to as the Great War. And then after World War II breaks out, it becomes known as World War II, or World War I and then World War II. Okay, so you'll also see it referred to as the Great War. So why did it start? All right, so like our other big events in history, I'm going to give you long-term causes and I'm going to give you short-term causes. Okay, so we think about like the French Revolution here is divided up into long-term causes and it's divided up into short-term causes. All right, so I'm going to give you guys those causes right here. So first and foremost, we typically credit the long-term causes to four main things. All right, first is the alliance system. Okay, so the alliance system is going to be all of those countries that have these public or private alliances together, which oftentimes those alliances could look very differently. Sometimes those alliances are going to be secret agreements. Sometimes those alliances are going to be public agreements. Sometimes it's going to be a non-aggression treaty. So it just means like, hey, if you get in a war, I won't get involved. I'll stay on the sidelines. Sometimes it is going to be a direct support treaty. So saying like, hey, if you get in a war, I'm here to help you. And then anything in between that. Okay. So these alliances, they're complex. It's not just a simple, I am going to support you in whatever war you get involved in. In fact, most alliances weren't like that at the end of the 1800s. Okay. And I think a lot of people tend to think that they were. And the way that we talk about World War I is saying that these alliances were, hey, we will support you no matter what war you get involved in. And that just simply wasn't true. However, what this does look like is this really complex, big spider web of secret and public agreements with all these different countries. Okay. So alliances, nationalism. All right. I shouldn't have to talk about nationalism at this point because that should be like, beaten into you guys. Nationalism is the most important ism of the 1800s. Okay, it's arguably the most important ism today, even. It is going to be, right, the intense love and appreciation and understanding of your unique culture, language group, history, customs. All right, that is what nationalism is. Now, nationalism in Europe looked very different depending on who you talk to. If you were Polish, all right, you didn't have a country, but you probably really wanted one. If you were French, you had a country, okay, and your culture and your history is probably centered around really complex things like the French Revolution, okay? If you are Serbian. If you're Serbian, all right, your country was just created. You want to protect that. You want to protect, this newborn infant of a country that was just created, because it's really special and it's really important to you. Okay, if you're Hungarian, you're part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you might want to just be part of the Hungarian Empire. You don't want Austria thrown in there, okay? So it's really, really complex, and it's really, really complicated, okay? But it's also going to be one of the big causes of why World War I is allowed to happen. Militarism. All right, militarism is really easy. This is just the building up of a country's military, which that makes a lot of sense, right? So this can be directly credited to a few things. Probably mostly is industrialization. Industrialization is going to massively overhaul the world very, very quickly, to the point where it's kind of like the saying, if you're not first, you're last, right? The old Ricky Bobby Talladega Nights saying, if you're not first, you're last. All right. Nowhere is that as true as it is in Europe during the Industrial Revolution. Okay. If you're not up to date with all the modern technology, then you are massively behind. All right. And this is especially true with military technology. If you don't have all of the brand new, cool military technology, you're going to get decimated in a war. Okay. And then on top of that, that military technology, it's updating faster than anybody can really keep up. All right. So militarism is going to play into that. And then lastly is imperialism. All right. And this is that connectivity of the world, but it's also the same, reason why we see war break out during the Age of Exploration. European countries have these colonies that are rubbing up against each other, and it's going to lead to more outbreak. All right. So those are our four main causes. Typically, you'll see those referred to as main. And yeah, I realize I don't have it in the exact order here. But you guys see what I mean. MAIN, main. Okay, so that's a good way to remember the causes is main. But you also have other smaller causes, crises on the continent. All right, so we'll look at these individually, but these are things that happen short term that are going to cause. They're kind of going to be those bullets that I talked about. And then, of course, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which everybody loves to talk about. And it is really a pretty fascinating story that we'll get to in just a little bit. All right, so these are our long-term causes. These are our short-term causes, okay? Make sense? All right, let's get into it. So we're going to look at each of these individually. Starting first with nationalism as a cause, all right? And I think, I really think World War I and World War II, to be fair, are like the golden ages of political cartoons. And so this is speaking to what I kind of talked about earlier with Great Britain and that call across the empire to bring soldiers to the army, right? The empire needs men. Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand answer the call. Helped by the young lions, the old lion defies his foes. Okay, so very patriotic, very nationalistic. This idea that we are all part of the same group or the same pride, the same flock, whatever you want to call it, and we owe it to the others to defend each other. But by the end of the 19th century, and this is kind of digging into a little bit of the late 1800s stuff, by the end of the 19th century, nationalism is being used to control people. And this is because it's mostly embraced by the ruling power, and that's the conservatives. The conservatives embrace nationalism mostly because they see it as, they see the writing on the wall. They see the fact that nationalism isn't going away anytime soon. So if they don't embrace it, they're going to face a nationalist revolution, nationalist uprising. And this mostly happens after the revolutions of 1848. When they see just that, okay, the revolutions of 1848 are liberal and nationalistic, depending on who you talk to. They're overall unsuccessful, but just because they're unsuccessful doesn't mean they're not scary. And they are going to scare the conservatives. And specifically, we can kind of look at people like Otto von Bismarck and Camille Cavour of Italy. Both those guys who are sort of responsible for unifications of their respective countries. they're going to be these new type of conservatives that are embracing nationalism as a way of control, but also as a way to rally their people around them. And Bismarck is going to continue to embrace this nationalism throughout his rule, throughout his sort of like stay in power. We'll talk about Bismarck a little bit later on, though. But it was also a way that they could shift focus away from domestic problems. All right, and we see this. We see countries doing this all the time, right? That you focus on the enemy, or you focus on like how, you say how great our country is because it's our country, and how bad it is because of these people. That's all nationalism, and that's nationalism as a tool of control, right? Rallying the majority. And it's going to be one of the big reasons why, and this is looking forward a little bit, but this is the big reason why the Nazi Party is going to target Jews, is because while there was a lot of anti-Semitism for anti-Semitism's sake in the Nazi Party, it was also in a way you could control people, you can manipulate people when you have a target within the country. So this is something that's happening throughout the latter half of the 1800s by the ruling powers, is nationalism. But also framing other countries as economic and military rivals. And this is a huge point here, is that part of what nationalism was having someone that you compare yourself to, at least in this sense. And so saying, so we'll see this happen with like Great Britain and Germany right on the outbreak of the war, is that they are going to frame each other as economic and military rivals. Same thing with France and Germany as well, is this economic and military rivalry. Now, why this is important is because while a friendly economic rivalry is not necessarily a bad thing, in fact, it helps spur the economy, more often than not, it can very quickly turn into something hostile, which you don't want. And that's kind of what happens, is it turns very, very hostile for a lot of these countries. Okay, because you still see economic rivalry throughout the world today, but very rarely, at least now, does it ever turn into any concrete violence. You could say that that China is the United States' biggest economic rival, but we haven't gone to war with China because we know that would be bad for both countries. Know that would be bad, right? We get that, and we have to learn those lessons the hard way. But we learn the lessons. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we still learn those lessons. But I want to look at a map real quick, because I think this is a very good map. So this is a map where you can see this is political boundaries, right? We have some political boundaries here, but we more importantly we have ethnic boundaries. So the different colors here are different ethnic groups that exist within Europe in 1914. All right, and we can see it kind of looks like scattershot in Eastern Europe. Right? We had all sorts of different ethnic groups throughout Europe that are really trying to coexist within the same country. And this is going to be tough, and this is going to cause a lot of conflict, okay? And when we talk about the short-term causes of World War I, it's this scattershot of different ethnic groups that is really going to be, I use this analogy, previously, the bullets in the gun, right? It's these conflicts that happen in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe. All right, so let's talk about the alliance system. We can't talk about the alliance system without talking about the boy over there, Otto von Bismarck, OVB. So, what was the alliance system? This was, and I mentioned it at the start of the presentation, the varying complex alliances were probably the greatest contribution to the Great War. Or, well, I'll say one of the greatest contributions to the Great War. All right, to World War And this is mostly orchestrated by Otto von Bismarck, at least in the latter half of the 1800s. You can make the argument that this alliance system really started at the Congress of Vienna with the Quadruple Alliance and the Holy Alliance, right? Starting the ball rolling that Europe is going to be engaged in alliances, which Europe has been engaged in alliances for a long time, but to the degree that it is in the 1800s, is never before seen. And we can kind of blame that on a few reasons. One, we look at like what were the goals of the Congress of Vienna. The goals of the Congress of Vienna were to keep long-term peace in Europe, right? And so one way that you keep long-term peace in Europe is you make friends out of your neighbors, and that's what happens. Okay, and throughout the 1800s, we have conflicts that happen, right? We have the Prussian wars when they're unifying Germany, right? The Austro-Prussian and the Franco-Prussian and the Danish-Prussian. We also have the Crimean War, which is probably the biggest continental conflict. But for the most part, we say that there isn't this like popping up of war that happens every few years that we see in the past, right? And so those alliances, they grow more and more complex when that war isn't happening. And so the alliance system, while it had existed in Europe, never to this degree, because these alliances weren't going to war with each other at all, right? They were just kind of growing and growing and growing more complex. But Bismarck in the latter half of the 1800s is really going to be the one who really orchestrates the complex alliance system. So he forms an alliance with Austria-Hungary. He also brings Russia into this with the Three Emperors League. This was, kind of because he realizes, and this is going to be always the big question with Germany. He realizes that they're right in the middle, smack dab in the middle of the country. So because you're right or the continent, not the country, excuse me. Because you're right smack dab in the middle of the continent, and you don't want to fight a two-front war, you make friends with the countries on one side. All right. So in this case, it's going to be Austria-Hungary and it's going to be Russia. And he realizes the importance of this from a military standpoint, not necessarily an economic standpoint, but a military standpoint. He realizes the importance of keeping your southern neighbors and your eastern neighbors happy and on your side. And these alliances were those non-aggression alliances, the non-aggression treaties. All right, saying countries would at least remain neutral in an event of a war, that they're not going to kill each other in an event of a war. And this is because, like I just said, Bismarck is going to want to avoid a two-front war. Now, we are talking about the Germans here, which means they do have a plan in case things go south. And their plan is the Schlieffen Plan. Their Schlieffen Plan was the plan to fight a two-front war. That will be talked about next week, okay? But even though they have this alliance in place, they are coming up with plans to fight a two-front war, all right? But this is why Bismarck orchestrates this alliance with Austria-Hungary and Russia. Now, Italy is going to look to join an alliance with Germany and Austria. This is going to create the Triple Alliance. And the reason why Bismarck even considers having Italy as an ally is because he wants to alienate France. Because really, Italy is not bringing much to the table for Germany. I mean, they really don't share a significant border. They don't really pose a real threat. So he doesn't need them from a military standpoint or an economic standpoint. So why allow Italy to join up in an alliance? And the big reason is to alienate France. And we got to think about, why would Germany want to alienate France? And the big reason is because France is sharing that western border with Germany. All right. And he wants France to not have any friends in case they go to war with each other, which, isn't out of the realm of possibility. Germany and France, or previously Prussia and France, historically, lots of conflict between those two countries. And we can almost date part of this back to like the 30 Years' War. And while it was France and Austria fighting against each other. We know that Germany is now wrapped into that a little bit because there was always that that competition between the eastern country or the central country and the western country in Europe. So alienating France is going to make sure that France doesn't have any allies here. So Bismarck's foreign policy was really kind of just hugely successful. Allied with Austria, Russia, and Italy, and was friendly with Britain. But the issue here is that Bismarck was the glue that held this thing all together. And because of that, when Bismarck is gone, the alliances are going to fall apart. But this is a relatively complex alliance system that's now in play in Europe. So we know that Bismarck is going to get fired by Kaiser Wilhelm II or Kaiser William II. All right. He fires Bismarck because really, frankly, he's jealous of him. He thinks that Bismarck is the one that's pulling the strings and he doesn't want that. Now, Wilhelm II is correct here in assuming that Bismarck is pulling the strings. He pretty much is. But by firing Bismarck, he really gets rid of probably the best politician that Europe has ever seen. Bismarck was great at predicting what countries were going to do and the decisions that countries were going to make. So when Kaiser Wilhelm II fires Bismarck, he lets this treaty with Russia expire. And this is a colossal mistake. Russia, who now feels alienated, is going to turn to France. Because France is also the alienated country here. And the analogy that I like to use for this is that, France and Russia, they are the kids on the playground that nobody wants to play with. Okay, and so what happens when there's two kids on the playground that nobody wants to play with? They form coalitions with each other, right? Which is what happens here. Is the Franco-Russian Alliance is this coalition of two powers that nobody seemingly wanted to be friendly with. And this is going to be immensely dangerous from Germany now, because now you have two countries that are friendly with each other that directly surround Germany. Bad news bears if you are Germany. Now, I also want to say that we can't blame World War I on a single person. We can't, right? It's too complicated. There's too many moving parts. But if we could blame World War II or World War I on a single person, it would be Kaiser Wilhelm II. Okay, the dude makes some colossal errors, some colossal missteps, some missteps that if it happened at any other time in history, it probably wouldn't be a big deal, but it happens at the start of the 1900s. It was a big deal. If you've ever listened to Hardcore History, Dan Carlin, he's got a whole podcast series about World War I. He's really, really interesting. I really recommend it. And the way that he describes it is he says, and you guys might have heard this described about rulers before in Europe, is that when you get a brand new emperor, king, somewhat hereditary, you roll the dice, right? You roll the dice on this ruler, okay? And you're hoping you get a 6. You hope you get a 6, and you hope you don't get a 1, right? You hope you get a really, really great ruler. You hope you get a Peter the First, or you hope you get like a Napoleon, or you hope you get someone really, really good. Oftentimes you end up with a mediocre ruler. And most times in history, that's totally fine. And Wilhelm II, he's like a 3, right? He's right down the middle. He's fine. He's not great. He's not, extraordinary, but he's a fine emperor. But this was a time period where Europe and Germany needed a really extraordinary ruler. And they just don't get it. Okay. And this is going to be a huge issue going forward. Now, this is going to be further problematic when Germany alienates Britain. So Germany and Britain rivaled each other economically and militarily, and this is fine, right? They were rivals. They were friendly economic rivals under Bismarck. This is fine. Not a big deal. Who cares, right? It's good for the economy. It's good to have some competition. It gets people buying stuff. It gets people producing stuff. This is fine. But Wilhelm II decides to really start a economic war with Britain. And he does this because he wants a navy. He wants the best navy in the world. Now, who has the best navy in the world at this point? It's Britain. And they've had the best navy in the world for a while. And that's kind of their thing, is having a really good navy and not really having an army because they've got a really good navy. And William II, he wants the best navy in Europe. And when he starts pushing for this, this is going to start an arms race in Europe between Britain and Germany. So to further kind of alienate Britain, William II cuts off all economic aid with the British. They try to really hinder the British control over Africa, because that was, Africa and India are Britain's, real economic assets. And they wanted to show they did all this to show the potential benefits of joining an alliance with Germany. It's kind of like beating up somebody that you want to be friends with to show how good it would be to be friends with you. It's this kind of like backwards weird logic that doesn't make any sense. But it's what we're working with when we get Wilhelm II here. So this is going to further alienate Britain. And it's going to lead to some of these smaller crises on the continent. So one of the first big crises that happens here is the Moroccan Crisis, where Germany attempts to incite a rebellion in France, or not in France, in French-controlled Morocco. Excuse me. They did this because they wanted to further weaken France. It's going to lead to an international conflict. I mean, like, this is literally like an international. A full international crisis. The United States gets called in to help. I mean, everybody really gets called in here, and it's really just makes Germany look bad, and it's going to further alienate Germany from the rest of the world. And this is going to bring us to the creation of the Triple Entente. All right, with Britain wary of German aggression, they're going to kind of begrudgingly ally themselves with France. Excuse me. They're going to begrudgingly further alienate themselves with France. Not alienate, ally themselves. Excuse me. And with Russia as well. The idea behind this being that these are the other two major powers in Europe. And this is like, one thing we need to say about this is the Triple Entente. This was not very concrete. This was not even really a non-aggression treaty. This was like an agreement of friendship, especially with the British. The British wanted nothing to do with the continent. The British wanted to stay in Britain. They wanted to stay on their islands. They wanted to rack in the money from their colonies, and they wanted to, maybe pull some strings on the continent, but not really. And they really just get friendly with France, and they get friendly with Russia. And they say, look, we'll economically support you, but that's probably about it. And it's nothing concrete. I mean, it's pretty much a handshake agreement. And but this is the early foundations of the Triple Entente. And overall, what we're going to see now is that we have two main alliances in Europe. We have the Triple Alliance between Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Germany, and we have the Triple Entente between France, Russia, and sort of Great Britain. All right, now let's shift and talk about military buildup. So the military buildup, they played a huge part in the European political tension. All right, so Germany building a new navy and Britain responding. The British, they build the Dreadnought in 1906, and this is a really interesting kind of individual piece of militarism that I think highlights a lot of why militarism is so scary. Is the Dreadnought. As soon as it rolled off the line and into the water, it made every single other naval vessel, every single other heavy naval ship obsolete. All right. It was a ironclad warship with nothing but big guns, big pieces of artillery. And all of the other large warships that the British had or the Germans had or the French had, they're obsolete by this point. The Dreadnought will crush them. And so immediately the British has to build Dreadnoughts and other countries have to respond by building equivalents. This is why militarism is such a dicey thing, is because it's just changing and updating so freaking quick. So the British build the Dreadnought in 1906. Between 1870 and 1914, France and Germany double their standing armies. And really, they use nationalism as a way for explaining how they were going to pay for everything. Pretty much saying that nationalism, this is why we have to do it. It's for the good of the country, right? That was the reasoning they used. So this is a picture of the Dreadnought. It was, by all purposes, a modern naval vessel, right? But it's nothing but big guns, big pieces of artillery that can shell other ships or shell even land units from miles away. More pieces of military technology here. And this is, especially the picture on the right, is a really good representation of what World War I was, which is to say it was messy. Okay, it was machine guns. It was pieces of artillery. It was gas. I'm sure that all of us, when we're learning about World War I, we learn about the horrors of gas and chemical weaponry, and it really was horrible. And there's a reason why you can't use it today. But artillery is going to be especially problematic, and it might be actually the big reason why World War I. One of the big reasons why World War I is so horrific is because you have these pieces of artillery that can bomb to like within feet of targets for hours and hours from miles away until there's absolutely nothing left. And if you can kind of see based on the pictures here what Europe looks like. It's desolate. It's barren. It's nothing but mud and dirt and maybe you'll see some sort of standing trees, but it's really, it completely changes the face of Europe. And again, I'll mention the movie 1917. They do a really, really good job of showing what trench warfare looks like and no man's land. But this is, and I'm not going to spend too much time going through this, but this is what the armies and navies looked like at the start of World War I by country. So we can see that far left column is looking at populations. So obviously Russia has the largest population here, United States and Germany being second and third. But if you look at militaries compared to that, look at Germany. Germany's got the third largest population, but they have the largest potentially available soldiers. Germany is still kind of has that Prussian mindset of being very militaristic, but also they're investing wholeheartedly into their military. They're investing into their navy. They're investing into all aspects of their army, of their military. So it makes sense why they were able to last for so long when they're surrounded by all sides. Look like Great Britain. Great Britain is heavily invested in their navy, not so much their army. The British really don't have an army at the start of the war. In fact, they really only invest a few hundred troops at the start of the war because they only have really trained a few hundred, maybe a few thousand troops. Very, very small standing army though. All right, so let's shift gears. We're not going to talk about imperialism because I think imperialism kind of speaks for itself in regards to a reason and cause for World War I. But I want to shift gears in the last 15 minutes and talk about the short-term effects of the war. So first, the Balkans. The Balkans are the most unstable place in Europe at this time. They are just a hotbed of competing nationalities. I said it looked like a scattershot of different nationalities and ethnicities. And there are going to be some events that further complicate this, starting with the Ottoman Revolution in 1908. Yes, the Ottoman Empire. They are going to be involved in World War I. World War I is their last hurrah. At the end of World War I, they are divided up, and we see the creation of the country of Turkey. And speaking of Turkey, the Young Turks seize power in 1908, and they attempt to establish this nationalist, kind of liberal government throughout the Ottoman Empire, which is going to come into conflicts with the nationalism in the Balkans. It's also going to scare other European nations. Is this a resurgence of the Ottomans? Are the Ottomans back? Are they going to come conquer Europe like the Europeans were scared of hundreds of years prior? European nations didn't know. And it's going to create a lot of real tension within Europe. Now, shortly after this, the Bosnian Crisis of 1908, one of the big crises that leads to World War I. Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, an attempt to create this buffer between the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary, right? This was because of the fear that the Ottoman Empire might actually need to be taken seriously now, which they hadn't been for a while. This is going to anger countries like Serbia, who saw themselves as kind of like the country in the Balkans, right? This is like the older brother looking out for everybody else. It's also going to anger the Russians, who see themselves as the protectorate of the entire Eastern European area. And really, it's going to speak to, like, is this an upset of balance of power? Do we need to step in here? But Russia doesn't have support from any of the rest of the European powers to do this, right? And so we're still in 1908. Balance of power reigns supreme, and other countries don't step in to get involved. And then Austria, with the backing of Germany, kind of threatens Serbia and says, hey, cool it. We're taking this. We don't want to hear anything from you. And they back down. Now, just a few years later, 1912 to 1913, we see a series of Balkan Wars that they go to war against the Ottoman Empire to gain more territory. Shortly after, a second war breaks out for how this territory is going to be divided up. Pretty much they go to war with the Ottoman Empire, they get a significant chunk of land, and then they go to war again with each other because they don't know how to divide this land up. Tale as old as time. Serbia, out of all this, emerges as clearly the dominant power. And Austria-Hungary, they come right into conflict with them. Austria-Hungary sees them as the big rival on the continent. Or in the Balkans, I should say. So Austria, again, threatens to invade Serbia. Serbia appeals to Russia. Russia is kind of like, we can't do anything because Germany's right there, and we don't want to get into war with Germany, and no other country is backing us up. And so again, nothing happens. Austria-Hungary is allowed to keep threatening Serbia, and nothing really comes of this. But all this to say that we can see this tension building and building and building and building, right? Those bullets are loaded into the gun. Anything could pop off the Balkans at this point. And we can kind of see here what the Balkans look like in 1878 compared to 1914. They gain a significant amount of territory, and we see the creations of several other Balkan states, as well as the increased size of countries like Serbia and Bulgaria. All right, let's now talk about the big one, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. So on June 28th, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is assassinated in Serbia. He's shot by a member of the Black Hand, which is a Serbian nationalist group. And I have to talk a little bit about this. Okay, so the Black Hand had been organizing for a while at this point in a way to retaliate against Austria. Franz Ferdinand coming directly to Serbia was what they saw a golden opportunity. And so they kind of come up with this strategy. How are we going to assassinate this guy? And what they decide to do is kind of stupidly enough, Austria releases in the newspapers the day prior the route that Franz Ferdinand is going to be driving through Sarajevo. Kind of his car route, I guess. So the members of the Black Hand Several of them set up along that route, and kind of assuming one of them will get a shot at killing the heir to the Austrian throne. So the Archduke gets in his car and he's driving along, and a member of the Black Hand takes a grenade and throws it at his car. Now, the grenade bounces off the side of the car and it explodes on the side of the street, and the Archduke drives off with his driver drives off and zooms out of there, and they get out of there as quick as they possibly can. Now, this is where things go bad. The driver gets lost, can't find his way around the city, and he ends up on this off route. Obviously, gets off the intended route, but for some reason finds his way back on to the intended route and goes on that intended route. And at this point, most of the members of the Black Hand had disbanded and had gone home, and they were like, well, that was our one chance, and it's gone now, except for one guy. He was hanging out by a street corner. Okay, it was kind of where there was a big bend in the road in the middle of the city, and he's hanging out there, and he's just like, I'm just going to hang out and see what happens. And sure enough, it was almost like something out of the movie. The Archduke drives up right in front of them, and then the car stops. And we're still not really sure why the driver stopped the car right in front of the assassin. The assassin pulls out a gun, shoots Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife borderline point blank. All right, and that's the assassination. And it's this, forever will go down in history as something that never should have happened, but it did. So Austria is obviously outraged by this. They are outraged by the fact that Serbia killed the heir to the throne, rightfully so. But they're also outraged that they believe that the Serbian government had something to do with this. And yeah, they probably did, right? All signs point to Serbia, the Serbian government, at least funneling money to the Black Hand. But Austria is outraged here. And Germany, in response, they say, look, and this is like days after, they say, look, we will support you if you want to invade Serbia. Well, we're giving you a blank check of support here. We will do whatever you need us to do, but you need to move now. You need to get the troops together. You need to mobilize them. You need to move into Serbia. Austria does not move fast. In fact, they don't really respond to the assassination for a month. There is a month of time between when it happens to when Austria does anything at all. And at that point, the world had moved on. People weren't quite as sympathetic because even Russia can understand invading a country because they kill your heir, right? Even Russia probably would have backed down from this one. At least other countries wouldn't have gotten involved. But 1 month later, July 28th, 1914, Austria declares war on Serbia, and the spark is lit. The powder keg is lit. And it's only in time before it explodes. So we can see here the pictures of the Archduke leaving the, I believe it's the town hall that he's leaving from initially. And then the chaos after he's shot. And you can see on the right of that picture on the right, the assassin being arrested. We actually still have, or I shouldn't say we, the Austrian government has the uniform that Franz Ferdinand and his wife, and the uniform and then the dress that Franz Ferdinand and his wife were wearing when they're assassinated. And it really is, it's pretty sobering to look at that piece of history just preserved so well right there. Got a question. Why didn't they attack right away? Why did they wait so long? That's a really good question, Aubrey. And to be totally honest, we don't really have a concrete answer for that one. We don't really have a reason, a specific reason why. I've read some stuff that says that they were waiting for other responses from other countries, which took a little bit of time. They were trying to figure out the best course of action to take. It was a lot of different things and a lot of different reasonings. I would say that it was probably because at this point Europe had been in about a century of peace. And I say that because there was war, but they were trying to maintain balance of power, and Austria was afraid that upsetting that balance of power would lead to really, really big consequences. And ironically, they waited so long to invade that it did lead to big consequences. But I would say that's why. But there's no real big concrete answer why. All right, let's wrap this thing up. So on July 29th, 1914, Russia mobilizes troops against Austria to support Serbia. They're done being sympathetic. They're ready to invade. This is seen as a declaration of war by Austria and by Germany. They both declare war on Russia. And then the pieces fall into place. Germany declares war on Russia. Germany declares war on France. And then August 4th, Britain declares war on Germany. Okay. And just like that, we are thrust into World War I. All right. So, as you guys can see, this is a complex, big, crazy buildup to a very complicated, brutal, bloody war. All right. And like I said, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is the bullet, right? But there is a whole gun that needed to be built in order to fire that bullet. And hopefully you guys understand a little bit better of how we got to that point. All right. So that is it for me. I appreciate you guys hanging out with me tonight and learning a little bit more about the start of World War I. Next Thursday, we'll actually get into the specifics of the war and why it was such a crazy, violent, bloody war. And then what were some of those long-term impacts of World War I. But if you have any last questions for me, I'll hang out for the last 3 minutes. Drop them in the Ask a Question tab, and I'll answer them as best as I can. But the big thing that you guys need to take away from this, I think, is that remember the long-term causes and remember the short-term causes. Long-term causes being militarism, alliance system, imperialism, and nationalism. Short-term causes being the crisis in the Balkans and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. You remember those, you'll be totally fine for remembering the start of the war. And then, of course, be able to talk a little bit about them. Why were they important? Why were they a cause of a global conflict like this? But if you remember that stuff, you'll be all set. But I hope you guys have a great rest of your week. I hope it's productive. I hope that online learning is manageable and that you guys are crushing it like I know you all are. My name is Mr. Kuklik. If you have any questions for me, like I said, ask a question in the tab. I'll be here to answer them. And we'll make it through this crazy time, guys. We definitely will. Just keep pushing through and we will be all good. But have a great time, guys, or have a great night, guys. I will close the window. Oop, there we go. Have a great night, guys, and I will talk to you all later.